Hello, everyone, and welcome to what promises to be a fascinating discussion about Russia's cyber policy, Russia's approach to cyber and information security. We have today three distinguished experts, one from the United States and two from Russia. To kick things off, we have Professor Chris Miller, the co-director of Fletcher's Russia and Eurasia Program and assistant professor of international history. My name is Arik Burakovsky, and I'm the assistant director of Fletcher's Russia and Eurasia Program. And it's my pleasure today to be starting this event, and we look forward to the discussion. So Chris, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Arik, and thanks to everyone in the audience for joining us today for what I think will be a fascinating discussion and certainly an important topic for U.S.-Russia relations. I will add that this conversation is part of a much broader initiative between the Fletcher School and a number of partner institutions in Russia to try to better understand key issues in U.S.-Russian relations. And obviously, there's no issue that's more important than cybersecurity policy in terms of its ramifications on the bilateral relationship and on strategic stability. More generally, we've got three really esteemed experts to walk us through some of the issues at hand. First, Elena Chernenko is a correspondent at Kommersant newspaper, one of the most respected newspapers in Russia. Second, Oleg Shakirov is a consultant at the Peer Center, an expert on arms control and strategic stability, and particularly the influence of new cyber technologies on strategic stability. And last but not least, my colleague at the Fletcher School, Josephine Wolf, an associate professor of cybersecurity policy. I'll ask each of our speakers to kick things off with 5 to 7 minutes of comments laying out the key issues that they see. Then we'll open it up to discussion and conclude by taking some of your questions. You're welcome either to put questions in the chat feature and I can pick them up, or you can raise your hand. And as we get to the latter half of the meeting, I'll be able to call on you and you can unmute and ask your questions to the panelists then. So I'm looking forward to the discussion, looking forward to all of your questions, and I'll start by turning the floor over to Elena.
Thank you very much, Chris. It's an honor to be taking part in this panel, and I'm very happy to see so many participants here. So you asked us to start very shortly with an introduction where we see Russia's cyber policy and diplomacy going. So I've been writing about this issue since 2008 or so. What I can see is that Russia's cyber policy is very multi-layered. Unfortunately, or maybe some people will say, luckily, Russia didn't have its own Edward Snowden. So the things that we know about what Russia wants in cyberspace, those are the things that are being disclosed by the Russian authorities. They're made public. So we know the official position, what Russia wants in cyberspace. And we don't know very much about the things that Russia does in cyberspace. So when we talk about what Russia wants, it's a whole multifaceted activity at, for example, the UN, the main fora where Russia concentrates on promoting its cyber policy agenda. Since 1998, Russia has been proposing at the UN to establish some rules of behavior for states in cyberspace. Russia has been the initiator of the mechanisms that are the most known at the UN that do cope with cyber issues. For example, the governmental group of experts that produced several reports which contained a first, would say, a cyber codex, a first set of rules for responsible state behavior on the internet. Russia was also the initiator of a broader mechanism at the UN, the open-ended working group, which was established a few years ago, has gone through its first round, and will now continue to work on. At another track, Russia has tried since 2017 or so to promote the idea of having another global convention on cybercrime prevention and the fight of cybercrime. So the one track is the establishment of rules of behavior for states on the internet, what they should and should not do. Another track is this fight against cybercrime. Russia does not like the Budapest Convention of the Council of Europe that was signed in 2001. It does not like the whole document, but just one single point or one single sentence out of it, which allows, so thinks Russian authorities, for cross-border operations into another country's sovereign cyberspace. Russia does not want any other countries to meddle in its cyberspace, so it didn't sign up to that convention. And since a few years, it's promoting an alternative document, and that process has gone global. Just a few months ago, a whole new process was established at the UN where countries will actually try to look at whether they can maybe work out a new convention, whether a new convention is needed. And Russia is also the pioneer of that process, having already introduced a whole text for a new convention. The Russian diplomats say it's not something that Russia wants to like push for. They say it very elegantly that this is an invitation to a dance. So just the first draft, you can do whatever with it, discuss, create something totally different. But they say that the Budapest Convention is a non-starter. It doesn't have too many countries signed up to this. So those are the main efforts at international bodies. There's a lot of Russian diplomatic activities at other fora that deal with cyber diplomacy, for example, the OSCE, but also other regional organizations where Russia is presented at the post-Soviet space. And then there is a whole lot of activity on the bilateral track, where actually the first ever cooperation agreement on cyber issues was signed with the US. So the US and Russia were the first two major cyber countries to ever have established an intergovernmental cyber cooperation document. You can call it maybe some kind of a non-electronic, an electronic non-war. So they would try to communicate and try to cooperate to prevent incidents in cyberspace from escalating to maybe a real conflict with the use of conventional or other weapons. So there was a whole package of documents signed in 2013. And Russia was hoping to elaborate on this, to go much deeper with the US. A working group was established. It was supposed to meet half a year and try to elaborate in even a bigger document. But then the Ukraine crisis erupted and it all was frozen. What Russia and the US are doing now, since the Biden administration is in, they are trying to kind of look whether they can maybe not reestablish that working group and those mechanisms, but still try to do things to fight cybercrime. Specifically, the US is looking for actions from Russia on ransomware, but also on maybe an agreement not to attack critical infrastructure. And this is all done now on a bilateral track. There is not much information from these consultations, but there has been like 4 rounds of these. And both sides say that there is already first results that the number of the attacks, ransomware attacks originating from Russia, from the Russian territory has gone down. So there is several tracks of activity that are public that we know about. But again, I repeat that we don't know much about let's say the non-diplomatic part, but the real action part. And with this, I'll close my opening remarks. I'm open to any question. Just forgot to say that I'm not representing the view of my newspaper, Kommersant, but speaking for myself. And you might hear some background noise. That's the kids.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Elena. I'll turn now to Oleg Shakirov. I don't see his face right now, but I hope he's still on. Oleg, are you there?
Yes.
Excellent. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Eric. Well, Elena already touched upon most important and interesting issues. So I will just cover several other issues related to Russia's cyber policy. In fact, we shouldn't call it cyber policy because in Russia it's official information security. Even though Russian officials occasionally use cybersecurity, cyber attacks, cyber policy, and whatever, officially it's always been information security, and only in some exotic documents you might find the word cyber used. Otherwise, it's mostly information security. But anyway, so I want to focus on several issues. So one, when we talk about, for example, these bilateral discussions between Russia and the United States, there is this feeling of asymmetry that there are so many ransomware attacks in the United States, and there are no similar, well, virtually no similar attacks in Russia. So I want just to give some examples that Russia, of course, is not immune to cyber attacks, to cybersecurity risks, and we have our own problems. It's not usually ransomware attacks, but we have many kind of old school DDoS attacks. So, for example, this September, Yandex, which is Russia's major search engine and just one of Russia's biggest tech companies, they suffered the largest ever recorded DDoS attack, and the same botnet was used to probe or to attack several Russian financial institutions, meaning banks primarily. And it was reported recently that these attacks, they decreased, but this was a major situation in September and August. So another issue that you might have missed, or maybe not. So during the elections, Russian officials were very vocal about different kinds of well, not attacks, but different, maybe attacks on electoral infrastructure. And again, these were not like ransomware attacks or other types of attacks, but the Russian Ministry of Digital Development, the Central Electoral Committee, they reported several DDoS attacks on the electronic voting system, on other parts of this electoral infrastructure. And we have very different figures ranging from like a dozen attacks to 900 and more attacks. So we don't know, but this was one of Russia's concerns. And it's also an interesting example where Russia does not blame particular countries, but Russian officials say that more than half of attacks originated from the territory or from information resources located in the United States. And then you have Russian ambassador reporting this to the White House, to the State Department, the Secretary of the Security Council saying these figures at some public events. And so there is this sentiment that the United States is a major source of cyber risks for Russia, even though Russia does not officially blame the US government. So one kind of big story that is developing in Russia for many years is import substitution, and of course it is related to Russia wanting to rely more on its own powers. But when it comes to cybersecurity, I guess I wouldn't overstate the importance of Snowden revelations, but it was around that time that Russians fears about these secret backdoors and the possibility of foreign power exploiting some systems in Russia were kind of justified. And so Russia decided to switch to domestically produced software and hardware for critical information infrastructure objects. And of course, this is a very difficult task because many of these organizations rely on foreign-made software and hardware, and so the government is always kind of discussing with the industry at what point, what would be the deadline for switching to these domestically produced products. So then another big story that has been developing since 2019 is this stable or sovereign internet law. So when it was first introduced, it was justified on the basis that the new U.S. national cyber strategy, which was adopted by the Trump administration, it identified Russia as a threat in cyberspace, and that's why this law was purported to be a response that would protect Russia in case there was some kind of externally imposed shutdown or something. It was never clarified. So this year we've seen first evidence of how this law is being implemented. So Russian authorities required Russian telecoms and providers to install equipment, DPI equipment, and this equipment was used in several occasions. So first, it was used to basically put pressure on Twitter to comply with Russian regulation for taking down some content that Russia considered to be problematic on different grounds. So Russia, for I guess for 2 months, slowed down access to Twitter to some Russian users, and this could be labeled a success because ultimately Twitter took down most of the content that was flagged by the Russian media watchdog, and so it was kind of an effective tool to pressure an international company to do something that Russia wanted. Again, you saw a similar approach in the wake of the elections in September, where Russia also used this law to enforce some of its legislation. Yeah, so before I conclude, I would like to also highlight some of interesting developments in this space that are not related to the government. So we have a lot of regulation in all digital spheres, but this fall we've seen 2 examples of privately driven initiatives. So first, in September, there was an announcement of a new alliance to protect children in digital space. And it's basically an alliance of major tech companies, including Yandex, Mail.ru, Kaspersky, and others. And they would work on some measures collaboratively to protect kids, to raise awareness of some issues that may happen online, etc. So they want to make some kind of an organization, and vice president of Yandex is going to be the head of this alliance. And more recently, I guess it was last week, we saw another announcement by Russian tech companies and by Russian media, by a diverse group of Russian media, including the state-funded TASS and the Bell, which is an independent outlet. And they announced a new initiative. It's called the Memorandum to Counter False Information on the Internet. And so this is, in some sense, this is quite similar to what has been going on in the United States for past, I don't know, 5 years. So they pledged to work on mechanisms to identify false information, to take it down, to basically exchange best practices, to create some kind of transparency. So basically companies could voluntarily provide reports on what they take down. And so there are different perspectives from which you can look at these new private initiatives. One approach would be to argue that this is an attempt by industry, by media, to kind of self-regulate and to preempt some additional regulation from the government. Another perspective is that this is just part of the government regulation, but it was inspired basically by what government is trying to do, and now this will be done on not only on the executive side, but also on the side of tech industry and the media corporations. So these are just some issues that are happening now. I'm happy to talk about more about international stuff, and I would like to return back to you, Chris.
Great, thanks so much, Oleg. I'll turn it over now to Josephine Wolf, and then we'll gather some questions from the audience after that. Josephine.
Thanks, Chris. I spend a lot of time thinking and talking about Russia and cyberspace, and I'm realizing not enough time talking with Russians about Russia and cyberspace. So I'm going to offer a slightly different perspective I think from Elena and Oleg, and I'll be interested to hear their reactions. I think sort of, if we think historically, certainly from the US perspective, about what Russia's interests in cyberspace has been, Elena mentioned they were a driving force for the UN Global Group of Experts, which has convened for more than a decade and a half now. And if we go back to sort of the beginning of that process in 2004, Russia was really pushing for very, very sort of strong constraints on how states would use offensive cyber capabilities. And at the time, the United States was absolutely unwilling to make any of those concessions. And so there's this sort of early part of the international diplomacy process in which the United States feels that it is far and away sort of the strongest nation in these capabilities, that it has the most infrastructure, that it has the most advanced technology, and that it doesn't want to sort of give that away, that it's not willing to negotiate on that. And if we now fast forward to sort of where the UN Global Group of Experts is now, which is really nowhere, I think most people would say, a lot of that is about sort of a reversal of those roles, a reversal of the United States trying to say we want there to be some hard lines that nobody's allowed to cross in cyberspace, and Russia and some other countries, but largely led by the Russian delegation, saying, no, that's absolutely not sort of an appropriate way to think about making rules in this domain. And that's led to the creation of this parallel process within the UN, which Elena also mentioned, the open-ended working group, which is now sort of viewed as the Russian-led diplomatic process in parallel with the US-led global group of experts, even though both the US and Russia are represented on both of those groups. So I think you have sort of this interesting reversal over the course of the past decade and a half in terms of who feels that they are most capable in this domain. And perhaps even more than that, I think the thing that from the US side has really characterized the Russian cyber strategy for the past decade or so is who is most willing to actually exercise those capabilities. And that's where Russia has really stood out, not just from the United States, but also if we think about China, if we think about Iran, even to some extent, if we think about North Korea, Russia has been the state actor sort of most willing to push the envelope, most willing to say, we have some capability, we think we can do this thing regarding the Ukrainian electric grid, regarding certain kinds of infrastructure, and we're gonna try it and see how it goes. And that really stands in contrast to certainly what you see out of the United States government, which has been the development of a lot of offensive capabilities, and then a lot of fear around what it would actually mean to use them, what kind of precedent it would set, what kinds of retaliation it might invite. And so that trajectory has sort of led us to this point where the United States is at this moment very, very concerned about ransomware, and particularly ransomware attacks originating from Russia. Oleg talked a little bit about sort of the idea that ransomware hasn't been a problem, or as big a problem, certainly within Russia. And I think one of the things to sort of keep in mind is that the criminals who are launching these attacks have very deliberately set up the code so that it doesn't infect Russian computers, right? One of the sort of most widely circulated tips on how to protect your computer from ransomware now is to configure a Russian keyboard on your computer, because that's one of the things that many of these pieces of malware look for. And they say, oh, if you have the Russian keyboard configuration, we won't infect you here, because the criminal groups that are launching these attacks understand that part of sort of their sustainability as a business model is staying on the right side of the Russian government. So there are a couple things that I would just sort of call out quickly before we move to Q&A about the way that the United States views the Russian cyber strategy. One is that sort of pretty close connection with criminal or organized crime groups. And that the idea that sort of the groups that are providing the infrastructure and paying for the attacks on targets like Colonial Pipeline are not necessarily directly linked to the Russian government, but are being not just sort of condoned in certain ways, but in some cases actually passing information from part of those attacks for espionage purposes or providing financial support. And so that makes it very difficult to sort of disentangle who's behind what and perform really effective attribution beyond just, we think this originated in Russia. The other thing I'd say is that there's a tremendously sort of wide range of technical capabilities that we see coming out of Russia, and they span the whole gamut from, you know, this is a piece of code that I could go online and find for free or buy for $10 and launch freely, to this is a really sort of carefully engineered and well-tailored exploitation of a particular piece of accounting software that we know is being used widely in Ukraine or something like that. And so certainly the technical sophistication has ramped up a a lot. And I would say if you're sort of thinking about the other major actors in this space, there's much less restraint than you would see in the United States. There's much less emphasis on espionage and covert action than you would see in China and their cyber operations. There's much more willingness to sort of flaunt or show publicly what these capabilities are. And I think in many regards, sort of the sense of people in the United States at this point has been that there have been so few consequences for that behavior that it's only emboldened Russia and perhaps continues to embolden them.
Great, thanks so much, Josephine, for those comments. I'd like to encourage the audience now, if you've got a question, feel free to raise your hand using the hand function in Zoom, or you can type a question in the chat box and I'll try to pick up questions as they come in. But to kick off the conversation, I had a couple of questions that I thought would be interesting to pose to each of our panelists. And the first is looking at the role of US tech companies in the discussion of some of the issues that were raised. We just had an election in Russia last month, and US tech firms played a major role both in the Russian political debate about the behavior of those tech companies and supporting or tolerating certain types of political speech, and then in those companies' decisions largely to follow the instructions of the Russian government to remove or at least limit the spread of certain types of content. So I'd be interested to hear our panelists think about what's caused this, I think, notable shift in the willingness of American tech firms to follow instructions from the Russian government, and B, whether this is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of a broader reorientation of how US tech firms will operate in Russia, or whether we think this is just a small but meaningful shift that won't lead to a broader reorientation. I'll turn it over to Yelena first, but then bring in Oleg and Josephine after that.
Thank you very much, Chris. That's a great question. I think it's all about business. It's a business model. First, it's the fear of losing a market. And we have seen US tech firms cooperating with state norms and state demands, not only in Russia, but also in many other countries that have demanded them to limit or adjust their activity in their cyberspace, let's say it like this. So Russia hasn't been the first time. We have seen the same examples of US tech giants cooperating with the Chinese authorities whenever the Chinese threatened to push them out of the Chinese market. And this is a very interesting point. Josephine asked us to also a bit react on kind of what she was saying, and I thought it was fascinating and very up to the point where of this idea of the flipping the sides from what was a few years ago and now. This also applies to the question that you asked, Chris. When Russia was drawing up the first drafts of documents it proposed at the UN for these responsible norms of behaviors for countries, the first draft of such a big global convention, it presented in 2011. At the height of the so-called Arabic Spring, where Russian authorities were almost to the level of paranoia, convinced that the US is using all of these social networks and the possibility that the US giant tech firms give the government with which they are cooperating, so was Moscow convinced, to organize revolutions all over the world and here in this Arab region at that moment specifically. And they were pushing their ideas of limiting the behavior of states in cyberspace to kind of create these borders of sovereignty, to get other countries to agree on not interfering in their cyberspace by using, for example, social networks. And one could say this is only paranoia, and that's what we heard back then on the official level from, for example, the US, that this is only a wish to create censorship and balkanize the internet, make little internets that are controlled by the authoritarian governments. But it's not only paranoia. We have seen, for example, when you remember the so-called Iranian Green Revolution, where the peoples that were in Iran that were unsatisfied with the results of the elections when Ahmadinejad was re-elected again, they went out on the street to protest for this. At this very moment, Twitter was actually, the Iranian segment of it was actually planning to go on maintenance. This was planned for months. And as, for example, Hillary Clinton writes in her memoirs, That's where the State Department reached out to the Twitter management and has asked them to postpone this maintenance work because there is a revolution in Iran going on, and it's important to help the people organize themselves, communicate with each other, whether they could wait with this maintenance work. And that's what Twitter did. They postponed this. And because this became public first by US media, then it was confirmed by US officials. That's, for example, one of the reasons where the Russian government say, oh, US tech giants, independent, really? No. They're just a tool of the US government to meddle into other countries' internal affairs, help organize unrest, protests, revolutions, and so forth. And this is one of the reasons why, again, here we have seen this before these elections, the Russian authorities were so categorically demanding them to take off some content to oblige by their laws and their demands. And then we have seen that, that business went first before politics, and then they agreed to do this in the end.
Thanks, Lena. Oleg, anything to add to that?
So I think there is this part that Yelena talked about, the, I would say, more political part, but then you see that over past decade, these companies, primarily social media companies, but maybe you'll see more of that with other companies, they have become kind of more powerful. There are more instances where their own rules are applied in different countries. And so we see across many countries across the Western world that different countries try to enforce their own kind of regulations. We've seen this, for example, in February and March of this year in Australia, where because of local, national regulation there, Facebook for a brief period took down all news on social media. So it was kind of battle between Australian government and Facebook. We see this in France a lot. And so Russia is putting the political stuff aside. Russia is looking for ways to make international companies comply with domestic legislation. And it's not always easy because they have been primarily US companies, but with this global reach. And now these companies have to adapt. So I would say that there is this kind of global push back against these companies, and different countries are looking for ways to enforce their vision of how internet should be governed. And then you have this more political stuff where, for example, Russian officials said many times that they believe that Facebook is doing the bidding of US government, or is helping in some transparent or non-transparent ways. So these two kind of parts of concerns combine, and you have a more strict, kind of more energetic approaches to regulate tech companies. So I can speak more about different ways Russia is trying to do it, but apparently in the wake of elections, this was kind of effective, and maybe this would tell Russian authorities that they are on the right path if they want to kind of control the discourse and make sure that international companies are compliant with the Russian laws.
Thanks, Josephine.
I just want to add to that I think you're sort of seeing two shifts in the most recent app takedowns. And one is a shift on the part of the Russian government, sort of deciding we're not going to try to do this in-house. We're not going to try to block apps ourselves and build the technical infrastructure for that kind of within our domestic internet infrastructure, which is a shift from, say, when you see Russia try to block Telegram and they decide we're going to do that sort of through the telecom companies, and they don't do it well. And so I think part of what you're seeing here is Russia deciding either we can't do this, or it's not a good use of our time and resources, and we want to go to these intermediary companies that host these app stores and sort of tell them to take things down. And then the other shift you're seeing on the side of those multinational companies is the decision to listen to the Russian government. And that is a real shift, right? It's sort of, there have been a lot of laws or versions of regulation from Russia that tech companies have mostly felt free to ignore over the past few years. The sort of banning of VPNs was a big one among many of these tech firms. And the idea that Google and Apple would actually do something that the Russian government told them to do is something new. And I think Elena's right to say that has a lot to do with the willingness on Apple over the past year or two to take down apps that the Chinese government has pressured them to take down. I think that sort of makes it harder for them to take a strong stance against doing something Russia asked them to do, and also makes it easier for Russia to say, we know you can do this, we know you do this for other countries. But mostly what I would say is it suggests to me that both of those companies think there is a much more serious force coming out of the Russian government and targeting them if they don't comply than there has been in the past when they've been pressured or told to do things and haven't felt they had to.
Oleg, something to add?
Yeah, just briefly on the first kind of shift that Josephine mentioned. So I think the fact that Russia can go directly to these companies is not because it doesn't want to. It's not because it cannot use technical means to block them. It's precisely because it now has this leverage. So as I mentioned, we saw this last spring with Twitter, where Russia slowed down successfully. Well, not entirely successfully, but there was some collateral damage. But Russia successfully slowed down Twitter access to Twitter. This summer and fall, Russia took down, basically blocked using this DPI equipment, Navalny team's infrastructure. So it's because we now have this capability that maybe that Russian kind of demands to these tech companies were more had more power to them.
So I'd be interested to ask a follow-up question to all of our panelists, which is about the Russian leadership's threat perceptions. Because on the one hand, I've heard officials articulate what Elena mentioned with regards to the role of Twitter during the Iranian unrest about a decade ago. But it seems to me, as an outside observer looking in on Russian politics, that the Russian leadership's been immensely successful at stabilizing the political system, preventing any threats to their authority. And it seems sort of implausible to me as an outsider, granted, that any number of YouTube videos are really going to reset the political balance in Moscow. And so perhaps I'm misunderstanding how finely tuned the balance actually is, but I'd be interested to get our panelists' sense of to what extent are Russian officials overstating the potential threat to their rule that social media companies pose. Elena, I'll start with you, but then we'll turn to Oleg and Josephine.
I think that you are absolutely right about the stable situation right now. We have seen from all the recent polls that the number of people here in Russia that are ready to go for protest is very low. There is a number, I don't remember the exact numbers, but there is some part of the population which is ready to go to the streets for economic reasons, if their economic demands are not met and life gets really hard. But the number of people who are willing to protest for political reasons, out of political motivations, is very low. And for example, the support for the most well-known opposition politician in Russia, Alexei Navalny, who is in jail right now, has not gone over 20%, even in the times when he was coming back from abroad and being here imprisoned. So this potential for really big protests and revolutions is low. You're right. So maybe there's nothing to fear, but that fear doesn't. I mean, this position hasn't been elaborated today. It is more than 10 years old. It comes from these. From the use of social networks organizing a Twitter revolution in Moldova in 2009, if I'm not wrong, then Iran, then all of the events around the Arabic Spring where the social networks did play a big role and everybody was discussing it back then. Remember the anonymous movement to protect WikiLeaks, where political motivated hackers, hacktivists have shown that they are a force of themselves too. And then the support from the US administration for certain political changes in other countries, combined with their cooperation with tech giants, that all amounts to the already hawkish and a bit, well, say this kind of old time, I don't know, Cold War style mentality that all adds up to it, and there's blank danger. It doesn't go away, even if the political situation is stable.
Oleg?
Yeah, so since Elena already talked about the political kind of dimension, I would like to highlight another issue. So going back to what Josephine said, that we now have this reversal in the UN, that previously Russia argued for more like strict lines, now the US does. So I don't think so. I think that now we have this discussion around these norms, and of course the United States is more vocal about it. But we should remember that Russia was calling for a legally binding treaty, and Russia was actually suggesting to have a ban on well, cyber weapons, for the lack of a better word. And I think that part of Russian kind of threat assessment is that the United States is still the most powerful state here, which is kind of weird because we always hear about Russian and Chinese attacks, but we very seldom hear about American attacks. But I think that if you look at the amount spent in the United States on cyber weapons, well, not cyber weapons, on like offensive, on military and intelligence capabilities that can be used in cyberspace, we can surely see that the United States has a lot it can do. And I think that Russian officials are very kind of concerned about it. And even when we look at the talks that are ongoing, we always hear from Russian diplomats that they don't want to talk only about about ransomware, which they are okay with talking about, but they also want to talk about things in the military domain. They don't usually specify what exactly they want to talk about, but we constantly hear this concern about what the United States can do in the military domain, and there is very little trust in. Well, I think Russia does not expect that the United States will reverse its course and say, okay, we will now restrain ourselves and we will not do this or that. We will not increase our like stockpiles, and we can definitely see some signs of what the US can do. So with this WannaCry virus, where the NSA kind of exploit leaked and then was used by a North Korean hackers group to attack computers around the world, you can see that the United States has a lot of this stuff, and there is very little that you can do internationally to limit it. So that's why I don't know. I don't see kind of much progress in this regard if the United States does not kind of recognize that this military domain can be problematic, and that the United States itself can be seen as a threat by other countries. It's not only this what is usually referred to in the United States as Big Four. The United States is like big one in the eyes of many.
Could I ask a follow-up question to that, Oleg, and then I'll turn it over to Josephine? You know, you've mentioned the military domain, and I should be interested to hear your thoughts on if there were to be serious conversations about military use of cyber tools, and there's obviously the discussions underway after the Geneva summit between US and Russian officials that are somewhat related to this theme. What would that discussion look like? You know, in the nuclear domain, we can count numbers of missiles and numbers of warheads. How would we begin to, what would we count in cyberspace?
It's indeed, it's not an easy thing to even like talk about, because so for example, Russia has been proposing this idea to have and Yelena has written a lot about it, an idea to use the model of the incidents at sea agreement for the cyberspace, to basically create some kind of equivalent of an agreement to prevent incidents in cyberspace. But if you look at those old agreements, they're not very much applicable to cyberspace. But for example, one idea that has been floating around for a while is that so we have provisions in in bilateral US-Russia treaties on strategic forces that each side should not interfere with national technical means. So basically, with the satellites and other equipment that is used to basically collect intelligence, and that is used specifically to verify compliance with arms control agreements. So one idea was that now we have more digital threats to satellites in particular, and we can maybe have a separate agreement on non-interference with the satellites using all means. So it would explicitly name like cyber threats, but also like anti-satellite weaponry, etc. So this is one way you can do it, but it's where I realized that it's very narrow and it doesn't address most of what people think of when they think about cyber weapons.
And I guess the verification question is still also.
Yeah, so the verification, it's not, so look, we cannot even now agree on, there is little that can be, I mean, there is a lot, there is really deficit of trust between Russia and the United States. So even when it comes to cybercrime, very little can be done. So I don't think that it's probably a good time to talk about verification of like cyber arms control, which most like serious experts do not talk about. But there are many examples of behavior-based arms control. So where you agree that you will not do particular kind of stuff. Actually, you may agree that you will not. You can have a kind of positive obligation. So you can agree that you will cooperate on particular stuff. For example, on this, if you agree on an agreement on non-interference with national technical means, you can include some kind of cooperative provisions, and you can definitely verify whether another country is kind of fully compliant with these verifiable cooperative measures. So you will not count the number of cyber weapons, but you can count the number of kind of complete responses that you received to your request for information, for example. So I know it's not a satisfying answer, but it's saying that we cannot do anything is not satisfying neither. So I think we should try to do something.
Great, thanks, Josephine.
Oh, I'm certainly less qualified than Elena and Oleg to talk about what the Russian government's threat model is. I'll say, from the perspective of thinking about technical attacks, Russia is much better poised to withstand them because they have much less online infrastructure. So there's much less of a risk in Russia than there is in the United States of pipelines or power companies or other things sort of being connected to the internet or having automated their operations in a way that would make them very vulnerable to cyber attacks. It's not across the board and it's not necessarily permanent, but there's definitely a pretty significant discrepancy in terms of just the vulnerability of critical infrastructure. And I would imagine that sort of informs the threat model and informs how bold Russia is willing to be in enabling attacks on other nations' critical infrastructure. I'd also say sort of when we think about what it would mean to actually make any agreements or try to enforce them, which is a really important question, a lot of that is going to be about sort of trying to set certain targets off limit. And a lot of that right now, at least between the US and Russia, is very focused on sort of what are critical infrastructure sectors and can we even agree on what those mean and what targets we would be agreeing not to hit. And that is, I think, an easy thing to verify, or maybe not an easy thing to verify, but a relatively straightforward thing to verify, but then raises the question of, well, if somebody breaks that agreement, what actually happens to them? What kinds of consequences are there? And that's a space where I think we don't have a very good sense of what the answers look like yet. I'll say my sense from the outside of what Russia's really worried about online right now is its dependency on infrastructure from other countries and on like the domain name system, on the regional internet registries and ICANN distribution of internet addresses and numbers. My sense when I look at, say, the Internet Sovereignty Bill is that there's a fear that those resources are going to be shut off or withdrawn or in some way compromised that will affect the Russian internet. I think I think that's a hard fear to operate with on a global network of networks, because if you don't want to be dependent or reliant on other people's networks and infrastructure, then it's hard to connect to the networks in all of those other countries. But my sense has been that that's sort of part of the threat model that they're looking at and worrying about right now.
And Josephine, what's the scenario that you think Russia is most worried about related to this dependence?
It's a good question. I think, when I look at the projects that they talk about doing, I think they worry a lot about the DNS, right, which is this kind of central address book where when you type in a domain name on your browser, it tells you which IP address you're going to route to. That's something that's maintained by an organization that's incorporated in California and has often been viewed as a little bit of a sort of US run organization, though they would contest that characterization. And so you could, if you were the Russian government, worry that they would redirect people trying to visit .ru domains, or you could worry that they were going to cut certain resources out of the internet address book and nobody was going to be able to access those. I want to say on behalf of ICANN, they've never done anything like that, and I think they'd be unlikely to. But that would be the kind of scenario you could worry about, is sort of the way that Facebook went offline last week, and we were all sort of worrying about, what does it mean when a huge chunk of the internet disappears? That would be the kind of manipulation you might worry about. Sort of what if Russian resources or websites or domains were being treated in a similar manner?
Great, thanks, Josephine. Oleg?
Thanks. I just want to slightly push back against this kind of idea that there is major discrepancy between the level of digital dependency in Russia and the United States. I hear this a lot among American experts, that this notion that we live in a glass house, we are so much digitized, and compared to the rest of the world, we live on another planet. So of course, the United States is the leader in this respect, but I just looked up, so Russia is not far behind the United States in terms of how many users are, the share of population that is on internet. So it's very close. So digital economy and digital transformation are kind of buzzwords for several years in Russia, and many Russian kind of critical sectors are digitized or are going to become digitized. So Russia is very proud of its own tech giants. So they are also kind of a vulnerability if you look at it from this model. So I don't think that Russia is very, very different from the United States in this regard. And so in this sense, you can actually go back to the summit, and as President Biden said in his press conference, he said that he asked Vladimir Putin whether he would be upset if hackers took down a Russian pipeline, and Putin responded that yes. So I think we should not read too much into it, but this tells you that it's not something that is that Russians do not think about.
We have a question from the audience on the discussions and debate over ransomware that have accelerated over the past half year or year or so. And the question is whether we're likely to see change in the amount of ransomware coming out of Russia. And I guess I'd add to that the news from, I think it was 2 days ago, about the arrest of Ilya Sachkov, who's a cybersecurity expert in Russia, who is a critic of what he described as the Russian government's ties with certain cyber criminal gangs. So I'd be interested to hear whether A, that means anything, and B, how you see the general trend of ransomware developing. Yelena, I'll start with you.
We have reported about a week ago, so quoting Russian officials, that from their point of view, the first rounds of consultations have already been bringing some results. They were saying that 3 of the groups that originate their activity on Russian territory, Tripbot, Revel, and I don't remember the third one, that they started, that the US started providing the Russian authorities with more information on these attacks, and that they were able to start to arrest people and try to get this activity down. And then the bilateral cooperation agreement on legal enforcement from 1998 or so started working again, thanks to these consultations, and they were hoping to go into more practical things. Now, I have seen statements from US officials from officially, but also on background. The White House briefing said they agree that yes, the number of ransomware attacks originating on Russian territory has gone significantly down in these recent months. They were adding that they don't think that the problem is regulated and that it's over, but yes, it has helped. As for your question about Ilya Sachkov, I don't think that these issues are related. There is lots of speculations what is the reason for his arrest, and I would not maybe put so much accent and attention of the way that he criticized the government for not dealing enough to fight cybercrime originating from Russia, because on the one hand, yes, he was a vocal critic. He was saying that the Russian government should do more to prevent and to fight cybercrime. But on the other hand, he was also very much active cooperating with Russian intelligence services like the FSB, fighting cybercrime, helping them to cooperate with the Interpol. So he was part of that system a bit. I mean, he was an independent player because it's an independent startup, it's an independent company, but he was also cooperating with the government. See, he wasn't like in total opposition to it. It's a very mysterious story, and I'm feeling very like personally worrying about Ilya Sachkov. I don't know him personally. I've seen him a few times at panels and presentations, but I think that he is one of the brightest persons in the Russian IT business, and I really, really sincerely hope that this is some kind of mistake or that nightmare will be over soon. But it wouldn't be correct to put him like in the opposition to the government, because, for example, when he was criticizing the government for not doing enough, one of his most often cited speeches was done at a governmental forum when he was speaking to the Russian Prime Minister, Mikhail Mishustin, advising him to do more in this sphere.
Elena, can I ask a follow-up question, which is, do you think this is possibly evidence of debate within the Russian government or between different parts of the security services about the proper approach to this issue, or is that not a plausible interpretation?
That's one of the versions. I have seen like at least 5 or 6 versions that range from that one, from like geopolitical things to very, very down to earth. You won't believe, but there's so much rumors about this. One of the versions is that this is a revenge from certain ethnical groups in Russia that are trying to reverse his company, Group IB, from discovering how you say that. So there's this Russian version of The Voice, The Voice for Kids, where kids are. This is a musical show, and a few years ago, the daughter of a prominent Russian singer allegedly won that show. Won the when people were calling in and giving their voice to a certain kid, and she won that. And Group IB then helped to that this was a, Oleg, how do you say it in English? Nakrutka. So this was organized by a cyber attack. This wasn't real people that were calling in. This was paid for to make her get more voices. And she was then taken off the first place. They reorganized the whole show. And one of the versions is that the ethnical group standing behind that singer and her family trying to revenge. But it might sound crazy, but this is only because there's so many versions and so little information around what really led to his arrest that people are trying to discuss like the whole range of whatever.
Got it. Thank you, Elena. Oleg, anything to add on that front?
No, probably. I think on ransomware, I think there are a couple of issues I would just like to highlight. So one is that there is so what Josephine mentioned, that some of these groups, ransomware groups, they use do not. So basically, you can check if there is a Russian keyboard installed on the computer, and so they do not target Russian and other former Soviet republics countries. So in the United States, officials usually present those groups as Russian or Russian-speaking or Russia-related. But if you look at some of the indictments issued by the U.S. government, by the Department of Justice, you can see that when people are indicted or detained, that there are nationals of many countries, including Bulgaria, Estonia, like other Baltic states, Ukraine, etc. So
Latvia and Ukraine, right, were the last ones, I think.
Yeah, so I mean, it's not always like Russia, not always people based in Russia, and actually there are like some Russian-speaking cyber criminals. They like Southeast Asia, so they can be based there as well. So I think this is one of the challenges that we see now. Reports from Russian officials, thanks to Irina, and from the White House, that there is some sharing of information between the two countries. So it remains to be seen what exactly can be done. So one other thing I would like to add is that today and yesterday there was this virtual meeting hosted by the United States, which is called Counter Ransomware Initiative. And it brought together representatives of 30 countries to step up efforts to counter this ransomware threat. And you have many countries ranging from traditional US allies in Europe, but also you have Kenya, you have South Africa, you have Brazil, you also have Ukraine, you have Dominican Republic. So all kinds of countries, and Russia is not one of them, which is weird, because if you have problems with Russia and if you already are in the process of negotiating some kind of cooperation in this regard, so maybe it makes sense to invite Russia, because I can tell you what happens next if this kind of counter ransomware initiative works out some new standards, and then they come to Russia and tell Russia, now you have to comply with this. So Russia will not be very excited about following someone else's rules. So it's always, in my mind, it's always best to get Russia involved early on, that it can share ownership of this process, it can contribute what it has, and and work like that. But we'll see what will happen next.
Great, thanks, Josephine.
So I'm less optimistic about the idea that we're seeing a decline in ransomware right now. I'll say we don't know a lot about how much ransomware we see in general. It's not something that companies or victims are required to report. So all of the statistics are a little bit uncertain, or a lot uncertain, as the case may be. We're certainly still seeing a lot of ransomware, and sort of figuring out exactly how much of that originates from where often takes a little bit of time. So in order to say whether things have actually changed in the past couple months, it may be another month or two. I'm certainly not aware of the Russian government declaring victory on this front. I would say, in fact, or the US government rather, declaring victory. I would say, in fact, as Oleg brings up, the US government, to my mind, is moving further away from feeling like it's able to make progress with Russia, and focusing instead on other countries, and whether there is progress to be made with a different set of international partners. When it comes to the arrest, I think to a lot of people sort of in the international cybercrime fighting community, that looks like a continuation of an older trend within Russia, where people who are willing to work with foreign governments and help them investigate cybercrimes, or sort of dig into some of the digital forensics associated with those attacks, are often arrested and tried for that kind of cooperation. So I know less about the popular television landscape, and I would love to believe that is what is behind this, because for me personally, it's heartbreaking to believe that kind of cooperation is being punished like this in Russia. But that's certainly, I would say, kind of the leading interpretation in the United States.
Elena, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, it was Chris Inglis, the National Cybersecurity Director, who said, for example, on the 9th of September, that those attacks, meaning the attacks from Russia, has fallen off. The syndicates have, to some degree, deconstructed. That's what he meant to say. self-deconstructed, gone cold and quiet to see whether the storm will blow over, whether they can maybe go back. And then he said, it's too soon to say that we are out of the woods on this. So what I was saying is not like they was being optimistic, but they have said that for this moment, the attacks have fallen off, and then we'd have to see what happens next.
Great, thanks, Elena. Oleg, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I have a kind of broader comment. So I looked at the history of bilateral Russian and US agreements on related to information and communications technologies, and actually there are several of them. So there is a 1999 agreement on the Y2K problem. There is a 2006 intellectual property agreement that specifically mentions one piracy website in Russia. And so now we have this ransomware situation. So in all of these examples, you have the United States raising one very like kind of singular issue, and then kind of pushing on Russia to work, to cooperate on this particular agreement. And from the past, we've seen that Russia was willing to cooperate on this. But then you have this broader field of not only Russian, but kind of international concerns that there is a lot of uncertainty and distrust in cyberspace and lack of kind of rules. And this is almost never addressed bilaterally. Maybe it's impossible to do it. Maybe the best way to do it is through international forum. And we already have some norms. And we can debate whether this is the right approach. But
can I ask you a question? Like, I guess what does that mean in practice? An international forum, I guess, is sort of hard to disagree with, in its broadest strokes. But what would actually be discussed? What's the process look like? I guess that's the biggest challenge that I have in understanding. If there is to be a sort of expanded conversation of the type that's been kicked off, it seems, by Biden and Putin in Geneva, where does that actually lead?
That's a good question. And I would add that it would be helpful if Russian diplomats were more kind of eloquent, because they usually say that the United States wants to discuss ransomware, but we want the discussion to be broader. And then in the best scenario, they would name some other issues, but often they would just stop there and say that we want a broader discussion. So I think that no one knows, but I think the broader discussion would focus on some issues that Russia proposed, that President Putin issued a statement last year, and he mentioned this kind of cyber incidents. He said that we need to restore kind of interagency working group on information security. He also mentioned something about exchanging pledges not to interfere in domestic affairs, including through ICT, which I think would be difficult to implement. He also said that not only Russia and the United States, but globally, there should be some kind of pledge to basically no first use of cyber weapons, something like that. And I think that this issue about cyber weapons is not, it's difficult to address, but looking at many signals that Russia is sending, Russia wants to talk about it, but there is no easy way to do it. And maybe at least some general indication of interest on behalf of the United States to talk about these concerns would be enough for the beginning.
Well, I'd welcome any additional questions from the audience other than the ones that I've gotten this far, but I'll follow up with one more question of my own, which is thinking about which groups in the Russian policymaking process and in Russian society writ large are playing the biggest role in shaping these debates. We've talked about Russian security services, the Russian foreign ministry and Russian diplomats, the presidential administration. Obviously, Russia also has a relatively large tech ecosystem itself. Companies like Yandex are privately held, though have become closer to the government in recent years as legislation has changed. Elena, when you think about how the Russian government reaches policy conclusions in this space, who do you think are the most important actors in shaping what the Russian government is focused on and what solutions you think are best?
That depends very much on which sphere you're talking about. For example, if we're talking about this international sphere, the process is bilaterally with the US and other countries, events at multinational fora like the UN, then it's of course the government first. Russia is here not very good yet at working within this multi-stakeholder model. It's governmental, it's different parts of the government that are being involved in this. For example, right now in these consultations with the US, it's the Security Council that is the overarching part of this and that coordinates this process. And you named most of the actors that are involved in this. That's the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Defense, of course, the persecution. Oh, they say Procuratura, we say, so the office of the persecutor, so the legal part, they're all involved in this, but the presidential administration, so the Security Council is the head of this and kind of gives prioritizes so what has to be done. When it comes to areas where business has to be involved, some internal processes and tech companies are also being consulted. For example, that speech that I was mentioning of Ilya Sachkov, that was given at one of those meetings with the Russian tech giants like Group IB, Kaspersky, where the prime minister was consulting them to see how they could make more effective policy in specific areas. So I think that depends very much on what sphere you're talking about.
Oleg, can I turn to you next on that question if you have anything to add?
No, I guess Elena has already described the whole picture.
Great, Josephine, do you want to respond to that? Or if not, we've got a question from the audience.
Let's take the question from the audience.
Great. Gaurav, I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Professor Miller. Thank you, Elena, and thank you, Professor Wolf, and thanks, Oleg, for sharing all these insights. Very useful. My question is, like you have already discussed, or let's say mentioned about SovereignNet, and then China shared, and Iran is doing, and North Korea. So these four countries are working on making their own internet. Do you think that in the future, these four, they can make an alliance that they are somehow also already working on under the table? But do you see that they can build up as a monopoly that we other countries, they will be depending on the usage of technology when it comes especially to internet? So where I'm going with this, when we look at, of course, I'm going in a direction of nuclear and gas pipeline, which has not directly connected with internet, but as the way Russia is building up a monopoly market in these two fields, do you see that in future we will be depending on Russia and these 3-4 countries as alliance in terms of information security as well?
Great. Let me turn that question to Oleg.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, but so 2 points. So first, I think there is no kind of alliance in terms of building joint like internet between these countries. If anything, Russia would seek to have its close partners in the Eurasian Economic Union. It will maybe try to bring them together. I mean, regulation-wise, I think that would make a lot of sense. So I don't expect that Russia will kind of join Iran, North Korea, and China. Second, I think that we definitely see around the world in many countries, not only in Russia or China or Iran for that matter, we see different efforts to regulate internet domestically. In some countries, they are more kind of harsh. In others, they are more exotic. But I think it's not already kind of an exception. It's a kind of general practice that countries look for different ways to regulate their digital space, and so we'll definitely see more kind of dividing lines here. But at the same time, I don't at this point, I don't expect that we'll see the complete kind of break down all this global network, because Russian officials definitely and Chinese officials, they realize that in many respects benefit from having this access to this global network, and so maintaining it will also be a priority.
Like, if I can ask a follow-up on that, do you buy the characterization that some experts make that we're seeing an increasing divergence between different countries in the world into sort of two camps in terms of their views on sovereignty, regulation, and technology, and that there's more alignment than ever before between Russia and China and some of the other countries that were mentioned, or is that an oversimplification in your view?
If you ask me, I think it's an oversimplification. There is this new narrative that I don't like, that is building in DC primarily, but in the United States in general, that there is this new kind of battle between democratic, the democracies of the world and techno-authoritarians, and it's not it's not accurate, because we see many of these authoritarian surveillance practices in the West. There are many examples of the United States actually setting an example of using surveillance technologies that is then adopted by other countries. So in Russia, if we speak about regulation, so usually people draw parallels between Russia and China, and in some respects that may be true. But for example, if you look at data protection, Russia is looking at the European model very much, and even if it does not follow exactly this model, it's the reference point for Russia. So there are many kind of it's not as black and white. It's not as that there is one camp and then there is another camp. The thing is, we have many kind of issues that are part of this digital kind of economy, digital society, and there are different approaches how to regulate it. And I don't think that we have a clear lines. And maybe this is good news, because we'll have it will not fall into this bipolar digital system, but we'll have many different kind of intersections which will help us maintain global internet intact.
So one more follow-up that you sparked. I'd love to hear you explain what you're referring to by referencing Russia following the European data protection model and GDPR. What specifically are you thinking of?
So of course we have so actually if you for any Russia watchers, one of the kind of biggest problems in Russia is with data protection, because we have poorly regulated data markets and a lot of like gray zone activities in this space. So when people gain illegal access to some sources of data and they sell it in not very legal way, and as a consequence, many Russian computer-related crimes that are prosecuted. A typical crime that is prosecuted is when some bank clerk he sold access to this bank's database, and people could look up a particular person and find out all his personal details. So this is one part of the story. But at least legally, Russia is very much looking at the European model. So we have a quite strict protection of personal information, and at least when you deal with the government, it's quite strict. So you always have to fill out the form that you agree or do not agree to provide access to your private information. So going to different areas. So on AI regulation, when you hear Russian officials speaking about how artificial intelligence should be regulated, they do not adopt European model, but they always say the European model is too strict for us, and US model is too much based on private sector, and so we want to have something in between. So we want to protect some data, but we also want to allow private sector to use it to basically grow. So it does not mean that that Russians always adopt these models, but they are always a reference point. And Chinese model, I would say that I don't know, maybe Elena could argue with me on that, but I think that there are not too many people who are who know in detail what is specifics of this model. So it's common knowledge that they have this like great Chinese firewall, and it's well protected. But it's not kind of debated that as much as, for example, GDPR. So when GDPR was passed, everyone was kind of talking about GDPR, how it applies in Russia. Like companies were looking what it affects them, whether they should kind of change the practices. Like even in one organization that I worked for, when I was kind of participating in changing our privacy policy for the website, I was asked to look specifically at GDPR requirements. So there are many kind of, maybe not high profile ways, but there are many areas where Russia is looking at the West actually for examples of regulation of digital space. Well, actually, final example. So Russia is concerned about the fact that like Facebooks and Googles of the world are not paying enough taxes in Russia. And in this respect, what Russia is trying to do, they look at the OECD, they look at France when France is fighting with the US tech giants. So this is just another example where it's not necessarily this kind of China and Iran model, but it's something that is more maybe diverse.
Well, we're down to just our last couple of minutes. So maybe what I'll do is turn it over to Elena and then Josephine for any final comments, and then we'll wrap up the discussion. Elena?
Thanks a lot, Chris. I have just a short remark on this question that you had about whether there's two camps. No, I don't think there's two camps. I think we're in a situation right now, like in this movie, the 50 Shades of Grey, where there is so many camps, bigger, smaller, who get to influence what users see in their country and their region around the globe. And it's not even the governments anymore so much. We have seen this shift in the last years, how much influence over the content that users get, the tech giants themselves started to influence. Sometimes it's surprising, even from Russian standards, like, for example, the major social networks blocking the former US President Donald Trump. I mean, this was here considered by many people, by many liberal-minded people as well, as a direct censorship. You might like or not like a president. He's a president of a country. He is not a terrorist or somebody. Why do you block him? This was totally not understood here for people who argue for freedom of speech, because it sets a precedent for other countries to say, yeah, look, they blocked even the president of the US, and you're accusing us of censorship. Or, for example, when I was surprised myself, I wasn't going to post to my Twitter feed that story about Hunter Biden's corruption, but I was going to send it via direct message to another colleague to show what's being discussed. And then it turned out that Twitter doesn't even let you send it to somebody. You just push the button and it doesn't get sent anywhere. So I had to copy it and actually send it to her via the Russian Messenger Telegram, and then did go through, of course. So it's the tech giants that already get so much to say over what content we have that governments sometimes are so way behind and they're not the main voices here. And I think this is a whole new world that we're living in, and such acts from the tech giants to censor content, to decide what users get to see. This will have a bad influence for freedom of speech worldwide, because the governments that tend to decide authoritarianly, they will use this as a justification for their own actions. Thank you.
Great. And finally, Josephine, any final comments to wrap up our discussion?
Well, I would definitely agree that there are many, many different versions across many different countries of how to regulate the internet, not just two camps. I do think there are two really important camps, though. pretty much sort of championed, one by US and one by Russia, which are about who should control the fundamental internet resources, by which I mean the domain names, the IP addresses, the domain name system address book. And I think you have sort of the US-led camp that believes that should be this multi-stakeholder model with ICANN at the helm, at least for now. And then you have a Russia-led camp that feels that should be sort of one country, one vote UN model. And I think those two camps you've seen sort of solidifying over the course of the past decade, and that will probably continue to be a fight over the next several years looking ahead.
Great. Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this discussion. It'll be the first of a series of discussions on US and Russia cyber issues over the course of this academic year. So thanks to everyone in the audience for tuning in. Hope to see you again at our future discussions. And thanks especially to Elena, to Oleg, and to Josephine for their comments and an insightful discussion. Take care, everyone. Thank you.